Right, just remember, you were confident, you were filled with courage, you were a great public speaker. We got this. Alright, you need to face the camera now. You need to turn towards the camera. There we go. How does that feel? That's my... Well, a big g'day and welcome to Beyond at Home. We are so excited to have you here. My name's Riley and this is Kobe. Whoa. And whether you're clicking in from Facebook or from YouTube or even clicking into Beyond at Home for the very first time, we want to give you a little bit of scope as to what today's episode will look like. Because in today's episode, we're having a conversation that seeks to address some of the senseless injustice and tragic events that have taken place in the last couple of weeks across our world as a result of racism. We didn't want to be silent in this conversation, which is why we're joining the conversation by having that much needed chat tonight. Chris is going to lead us through that really soon. But before he does, we also want to let you know, maybe you're coming with an experience of church before where you have a lot of pushbacks and you wouldn't even dare step into a physical building, and it's a big deal for you joining us here online. We want to let you know we're so glad that you're here. Here at Beyond, we want to create a church that unchurched people love to attend or love to engage with. So if you're coming with questions about life or even questions about faith, we hope Beyond at Home is an awesome starting point for you. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. We'll catch you later.
Normally, this is the part of Beyond at Home where I jump in all excited and I tell you what we're going to be talking about today and how our conversation is going to help you. But that would be misleading in light of today's topic. In fact, we decided to press pause on our regularly scheduled Beyond at Home programming to begin to talk about the events that happened in the United States that have sparked ripple effects across the globe and have impacted us here in Australia. So get comfy because this conversation is going to get a little bit awkward and we're going to get really honest. There's a moment in the life of Jesus that we actually looked at a couple of weeks ago, and it's a moment where Jesus arrives too late to help his friend Lazarus. And Lazarus' sister Mary and Martha meet Jesus as he approaches and they lead him to Lazarus' tomb. And it's not really like a grave, it's actually more like a cave. And as they're leading him to this cave, they're distraught. Their brother has died. And Jesus, before he offers a solution, before he talks about a way forward, Jesus enters into their pain and enters into their suffering and weeps with them. And this was such an emotional moment. It was such a powerful moment for the people who were there watching this transpire, that they commented, "See how much he loved him." In some ways, this is that moment for us. It's a moment to sit in the pain of our First Nations people here in Australia, but also people all around the world who experience this. It's a moment for us to connect our current losses to the undercurrent of racism that is still prevalent here within our country. And in this moment, to weep with those who weep and mourn with those who mourn. It's in these moments that empathy is born. And it's when empathy is born that conversations can begin. And often that's where solutions are found. Over the past few weeks, I've been having a number of conversations with people about these events. And one thing that's emerged over and over again that people say is these events just make them sad. But let's be honest, sad is something you talk about or say when something doesn't impact you directly. And I hope we can all agree that this issue is far bigger than sadness, that this issue impacts all of us either directly or indirectly. And so for all of us, this has to be bigger than sadness because it has to be personal. Dr. Martin Luther King said it so well when he said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." So for us as a nation to kind of move past this point with nothing more than a case of sad would be to miss the significance of this moment. Dr. King then went on to say, "We are tied together in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied together with a single garment of destiny." We've seen this with the tragic events surrounding the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd have sent shockwaves around the world that have impacted us here in Australia, that have caused us as a society to begin to address things that we've ignored, that we've avoided, and that we've simply hidden, and bring them into the light. What Dr. King says next is a reason why this is an issue that impacts us all, where he says whatever affects one directly impacts all indirectly. Therefore, this is not an us versus them conversation, because there is no us versus them. There's only us. So sad isn't enough. And I don't have to tell our First Nation brothers and sisters that sad isn't enough, because you're not sad, you're mad. Because when you saw George Floyd saying, "I can't breathe," you didn't see a stranger with a knee on their neck. You saw you. You saw your father, your husband, your son. Now, before I go any further, let me just say that a conversation like this is a minefield for people like me. But I believe it's a conversation that we need to wade into. Here's what makes it even more challenging to wade into this conversation. You. And I'll tell you why. Because if you were a church that leaned one way or the other, then my role would simply be to get up and give you a pre-prepared position. I would be speaking to the choir and you'd clap and everyone would go home as if nothing had ever changed. But you're not like that. And you know, maybe you've been to churches like that in the past, and really how those churches make people feel is if you don't agree with us, then you're going to hell. But one of the things I love about you, Beyond, is that you refuse to sit on the extremes. Because on either edge of the extremes, where people sit in their echo chambers, no progress is made. Instead, progress is made in the messy, messy middle. Because it's in the messy, messy middle where relationships are formed, where empathy is discovered, and where experiences with other people are shared. It's in the messy, messy middle where we discover all the facts instead of just the ones that support our worldview. For example, here's some uncomfortable facts that came out of research done at the University of Western Sydney that surveyed 6,000 people in terms of cultural attitudes and beliefs towards certain cultures. Here's what they said. I want to read them to you so I get them right. 32% had experienced racism in the workplace. 32% as well had also experienced racism in an educational facility. 31.6% of respondents claimed to have negative feelings towards Muslim Australians. 22.4% claimed to have negative feelings towards Middle Eastern Australians. And 9% had negative feelings towards Aboriginal Australians. What that tells me is that racism is still alive and well in Australia. Now, here's where this gets challenging. If you've ever personally experienced racism in Australia, it does nothing to tell you all the times the criminal justice system has worked in your favour. It does nothing to tell you that the majority of police officers are actually really great people who do the best job they can do to uphold the law. And the reason that it doesn't help you is because of your experience. It's kind of like having a fear of flying. You can have all the statistics that you want. You can be told that, hey, it's actually safer to go up the Bruce Highway than it is to get in a plane. But that does nothing to quell the fact that when you get in a plane, you experience that fear of flying. The reality is there's only one thing that has the potential to remove or begin to remove deep-seated fear and trust issues. And that thing is experience. And to help us begin to unpack this, I want to ask us two questions. And the first one is this: what do people who don't look like you experience on the other side of you? Now, be careful with this question. No, I didn't say, what do you believe about people who don't look like you? Not what do you think about people who don't look like you? What I asked you is, what do people who don't look like you experience on the other side of you? In other words, when you come eyeball to eyeball with someone who does not look like you, what do they walk away feeling? Now, this second question is where we're going to spend the majority of our time. And the second question is this: what should people who don't look like you experience on the other side of you? Now, if you're not a Jesus follower, this is really as far as I can take you on our journey today. Although that's still a lot to chew on, those two questions alone. But if you are a Jesus follower, there's a lot more to go. The reason that there's more for us to consider for those of us who are Jesus followers is because Jesus tells us exactly what someone on the other side of us should experience. It's something we talk about a lot here at Beyond. It's something that is central to who we are. And it's something that's known as the law of Christ. Now, I want to be clear, this is not the 10 Commandments. And this is not the 10 Commandments because you can keep the 10 Commandments perfectly and still be a racist. We know this because Paul, who goes down in history as a Jesus follower, is someone who said that he kept the law perfectly. Up until the time he began to follow Jesus, he said he kept the law perfectly. Yet he hated Gentiles and he murdered Jesus followers. And in a single day, Paul had an experience with Jesus, and it completely transformed his way of thinking. And he began to think in terms of the law of Christ, this love one another way of life. In fact, the night before Jesus was crucified, he took the 10 Commandments and turned them into one transgenerational commandment that, if we get right, has the potential to change everything. He said, love one another. Now, this isn't the new part of the command. That had kind of always been there. What's new is the way in which Jesus defines the way in which we are to love one another. He said, as I have loved you, so you must love one another. Now, if you're a Jesus follower, I really need you to pay attention. And normally I wouldn't be so forceful, but I need you to understand, this is not a new suggestion from Jesus. This is a new command, which means there is no wriggle room for you. This is not a when I feel like it or when I'm in the mood or when someone else is being nice to me. No, this is love other people the way that God, through Jesus, has loved you. And here's why this isn't a suggestion for those of us who are Jesus followers, because of what Jesus says next. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love others the way that I have loved you. So what should people who don't look like you experience on the other side of you? That. Then Paul, who I mentioned earlier, he comes along and he elaborates on this one another thing. And he begins to describe what exactly it looks like to love one another the way that God through Christ has loved us. And he writes this, carry each other's burdens. But then he goes on to tell us what will happen if we do that. He says, in this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. Here's why this is so powerful. Because when we begin to carry each other's burdens, what divides us diminishes, and the things that unite us begin to surface. You see, when I begin to carry your burdens, I gain an insight into why you sit and how you view the world the way that you do. And when you begin to carry my burdens, you gain an insight into how I sit and why I view the world in the way that I do. When the concerns of others concern you, you are fulfilling the law of Christ. And when the concerns of others concern me and impact the way I respond, I am fulfilling the law of Christ. And when the law of Christ informs our collective conscience as a local church, well, could you imagine if the law of Christ was to inform our collective conscience as a nation? We would begin to find common ground with people who don't share a common culture or a common experience. Now, here's how you know if you're getting this right if you're a Jesus follower. If your culture and someone else's culture take second place to the one another culture that Jesus introduced into the world. Because there are times when my culture will get in the way of loving someone else and the one another culture that Jesus introduced into the world. And when that occurs, that part of my culture may need to be temporarily suspended or permanently retired. Otherwise, we will never step across the line to carry the burdens of others. Now, as we bring our time together to a close, let me get really practical with you, because that's just who we are at Beyond. Because if we don't get practical, it's not going to change your life or the lives of others. So here's the first practical thing. It's not enough to be a non-racist. As a Jesus follower, we need to be anti-racism. Think about it this way. You don't satisfy yourself by saying, oh, I'm non-child abuse. If you walk down the street and you see someone abusing a child, it's not enough ever for you to go, oh, well, because I don't abuse children, it's okay. It's not enough to be non-child abuse, just like it's not enough to be non-domestic violence. No, as Jesus followers, we need to be anti-racism, which means we need to speak out about it. We need to call it out when we see it and let it be known that it is not acceptable in any way, shape, or form as a Jesus follower to be a racist. And if we're really going to carry someone's burdens, we need to get up under it, which means we need to feel the weight of their burdens. And when we feel the weight of their burdens, someone else's burdens become our burdens. And we stand up and we speak up about it. Now, let me just say from personal experience, when you begin to become anti-racism, when you begin to speak out when you see it, you may just discover a racist in the mirror. You may just discover that there were parts of you masquerading as pride that were really racism. And the reality is, for some of you watching, you will never begin to uproot the racism that exists in your heart until you begin to speak out against it. For some of you, maybe you'll never fully uproot the deep-seated racism that exists within your heart. But that shouldn't change the way that people on the other side of you experience you, because that's a command from Jesus. Here's the second thing you need to understand if you're going to change what people experience on the other side of you. It's that proximity is not friendship. Just because you know the names of people who don't look like you doesn't mean you're friends with people who don't look like you. In fact, most of Jesus' life was characterized by spending time with people who did not look like or share the same views or values as him. A lot of people like me, unfortunately, have mischaracterized Jesus, maybe leading you to believe that he spent a lot of his time with the poor and the downtrodden. But that's not the entire story. Jesus spent time with rich people, with poor people, with women, which was outrageous to do in that culture. He spent time with religious and irreligious people. He spent time with a whole bunch of people who did not look like him and certainly didn't share his views and values when it came to the way he lived his life. In fact, in the conversation where Jesus gives his new command, he looks around the room and he looks into the eyes of laborers, day traders, fishermen, a religious zealot, and a traitor. And he looks into their eyes and he says, I have called you friends. These people who are nothing like Jesus, Jesus looks at them and says, you are my friends, even though we're so different. And then he says, you didn't choose me, I chose you. Jesus said, I pursued you, even though you don't look like me, and I chose you. And that's how we as Jesus followers are to pursue our relationships, up close and personal. And here's what I want you to know. If we fail to listen to people who don't experience the world the way that we do, we will never be able to carry their burdens. And if we fail to do that, then we can wear the label Christian, but we dare not call ourselves Jesus followers because we are not fulfilling the law of Christ. So, what do people who don't look like you experience on the other side of you? Will you begin to make the shift from non-racism towards anti-racism? And what should people who don't look like you experience on the other side of you? Will you not settle for proximity, but move towards friendship? And in doing so, begin to bear the burdens of others. When you begin to do this, you'll do what Jesus has called us to do all along. Love others the way that he loved us.
Thanks so much again for joining us for Beyond at Home. Hey, maybe you have some questions coming out of today's episode, or you might like to keep the conversation ongoing. If that's something you'd be interested in, we'd love to invite you along to some of our Connect groups that have been meeting online. If you'd love to find out more about our groups that have conversations and discussion about what we talked about in today's episode and each episode, then we'd love to invite you to click on the link in the comment section right now that'll take you to some information about some next steps that you can take to learn and grow some more. I know it's very exciting. Outside of that, if you don't want to click the link, you can always just type in Connect into the comment section And once you type in connect, one of our Beyond team leaders will hook you up with some more info. If that's something you're interested in, make sure you do that. Outside of that, we got some really exciting news. Next Sunday, we are premiering a whole brand new series. If you're someone who has foot and mouth disease, if you've said something in this season of ISO that you really regret to somebody else, then we'd love to invite you along to this brand new series called Me and My Big Mouth. It's all about keeping your mouth in check. If that's something you're interested in, invite a friend along, tag them in the post. We'd love to see you there as it premieres next Sunday. You can always like or subscribe to our Beyond at Home episodes as well if you're interested, and that way you'll always be up to date with what's happening next. We hope you have a great rest of your week. Thanks again for joining us at Beyond at Home.
This is Perfect Love by Kingdom Culture. You are the one that surpasses all borders and time. You stepped across all the boundaries and walls in my mind. You are the one who came by the water and blood. You testified against fear and replaced it with love. Perfect love drives out fear and love forgets all the years that were stolen and were broken. You're restoring them all. Perfect love drives out fear and love forgets all the years that were stolen and were broken. You're restoring them all. This is Do It Again by Elevation Worship. Walking around these walls, I thought by now they'd fall, but you have never failed me yet. Waiting for change to come, knowing the battle's won, for you have never failed me yet. Your promise still stands, great is your faithfulness, faithfulness. I'm still in your hands, this is my confidence, you never failed me yet. I know the night won't last, your word will come to pass. My heart will sing your praises. Jesus, you're still in love. Keep me within your love. My heart will sing your praise again. Your promise still stands, great is your faithfulness, faithfulness. I'm still in your hands, this is my confidence, you never fail me yet. I've seen you move the mountains, and I believe I see you do it again. You made a way when there was no way, and I believe I'll see you do it again. I've seen you move the mountains, and I believe I'll see you do it again. You made a way when there was no way, and I believe I'll see you do it again. I've seen you move the mountains, and I believe I'll see you do it again. You made a way when there was no way, and I believe I'll see you do it again. Promise to stand, great is your faithfulness, faithfulness. Still in your hands, this is my confidence, never fail. Your promise still stands, great is your faithfulness, faithfulness. Your hands, this is my confidence, never fail me yet. I've seen